Colonial reach was limited, it was uneven, and for men in much of Melanesia, it brought a period of massive upheaval. It changed the relationships between successive generations of men. It gave rise to new forms of leadership. And indeed, as areas became progressively under government control, practically all Indigenous ritual activity ceased. These bachelor cults, graded initiation in which men had participated and which had dominated their lives to that point, were abandoned. Prior to the abandonment of these cults, they served a really important purpose, and that was to regulate the relationships between different generations of men. So young boys would go into these cults at maybe 6, 8 years of age and wouldn't emerge until they were 20, 25. They would then come out of the cults, they would marry, they're marrying in their late 20s sort of thing, by which time their own fathers are often dead. So these men are emerging from the cult and they are expected to to fully embrace adulthood, to be the political leaders, In the contemporary context, with the arrival of Christianity, with men and women now living in households together, what we see is that generations are contracting, so people are getting married younger. Health provision is better, so people are living longer. And now what you can actually have is a situation where you've got 3, sometimes 4 generations of adult men that are alive within the same community. So within the clan, within the group, there's this intergenerational conflict between men. And we see that played out particularly in the electoral context, in the context of extractive resource industries, resource development, because different generations of men want to be the ones that are negotiating with the mining company, wanting to have a say, wanting to represent their community. So these, sorry, I know I'm spending a lot of time going into this, but I think these are really important things to understand in terms of this really rapid social and cultural change and the way that that's sort of impacting upon communities and the way that that term, plays out in terms of, different forms of violence that contribute to insecurity and the way that people experience their lives. Okay, the other thing was that in the past there were factors that constrained conflict, and there were well-established procedures to ensure that disputes were resolved. And in the contemporary context, many of these mechanisms have broken down or under serious strain. So, for example, in the past, problems were dealt with, albeit often violently, within the group, but in such a way to limit further violence or conflict. So in other words, conflict and violence were used as a means of settling disputes. So for instance, young men that constantly caused problems within their group, they were sort of going around raping women, causing all sorts of problems. And the community, their clan, would often then pay compensation to the victim's family. And so, the behaviour of young men and women, in fact, can bankrupt clans, if they're continually behaving badly. So in the past, their family, their fathers, their brothers, etc., would often kill young men that were behaving in that sort of way. Similarly, women that were accused of witchcraft were often dealt with by the clan. And that meant that they were killed. What didn't happen, though, was that they weren't tortured and different things. So in the contemporary context, we're seeing these contemporary witch trials where women are tortured over long periods. There was a case earlier in the year where a woman was burnt alive at Hagen Market, and different things. And we're seeing lots and lots more of these sort of cases, and they're people are talking about this sort of epidemic of witchcraft-related violence, which seems to have coincided very much with the spread of HIV and HIV epidemic in many respects, because HIV produces the exact kind of deaths that result in witchcraft accusations. So people's experiences of illness and death are often that babies, young children die. You know, there's high mortality, under 5 mortality, and often that old people die. And oftentimes when, you know, young babies die or old people die, their deaths don't necessarily result in witchcraft accusations. But if a young person in the prime of their life becomes sick and dies, it's particularly those sorts of deaths, you know, traditionally and historically, that resulted in witchcraft accusations. And of course, HIV produces deaths of young, you know, sort of active middle-aged people. So it seems to be contributing very much to an increase in accusations, and then very much an increase in violence. So. But a key point was that in the past, if the clan or the group dealt with a woman that was accused of witchcraft and killed her, it had the effect of limiting it. Because the fathers and the brothers would kill the woman involved, there would often be an autopsy, or a ritual specialist would be brought in to divine after the fact to determine whether or not she had actually been a witch. If it was determined that in fact she was a witch, then there was no compensation payable. If, however, they went, oh, oops, sorry, she wasn't a witch, then the father's relatives would pay compensation to the mother's relatives. But again, it would limit the amount of compensation that was paid, and it would limit the possibility of that dispute coming up again. In the contemporary context, what we see is that with these witch trials and these witch killings, it's now young men from other groups, young men policing the actions of women from other groups. So instead of the matter being dealt with within the clan, you will accuse somebody from another group, and the young boys will go and round them up and torture them. So very different. It's then it then sort of spreads out into the community, because there's compensation claims, etc., and they're not limited in the same way that they were in the past, which then means that these disputes are likely to be brought up over and over again, the same issues. Okay, so contemporary Melanesian conceptions and assertions of gender and gender relations pose a fundamental challenge to the democratic notion of equal participation for all, and result in a host of inequitable outcomes for women, such as underrepresentation in politics and political processes, limited freedom of movement, and poor health. Sexual violence is pervasive in PNG, although the full extent of the problem is difficult to gauge, as there has been no nationwide generalisable research undertaken since the Law Reform Commission's seminal study in 1982. What we do know, though, is that gender-based violence is generally underreported. It's often culturally sanctioned and tacitly accepted by the community. It has devastating impacts on individuals, families and communities, and there has been very little legislative reform. Research undertaken as part of the Small Arms Survey that I mentioned earlier revealed family and sexual violence to be the chief cause of insecurity in Southern Highlands and NCD. And even then, though, victimisation rates were largely underreported. So the qualitative investigations that we did alongside the survey showed that we'd picked up only the most serious cases. Most communities in PNG tend to view domestic violence as a private family matter, and as such, few cases concerning domestic violence ever come before the courts. It's been suggested that 80 to 90% of women seeking medical treatment do so as the result of domestic and family violence.